My name is Jorge Luis García. I'm an economist. I'm a graduate of the University of Chicago, where we're at right now. And right now, I'm a professor of economics at Clemson University, where I teach economics of education, economic development, and econometrics. And I just want to talk a little bit about my research. What I'm really interested in these days is to try to figure out what are the economic fundamentals driving the success of policies that alleviate poverty. And by that I mean, how do we configure a set of policies that tackle the issues that relatively disadvantaged people socioeconomically face? How do we build skills so that they're more competitive in the labor market? So, trying to figure out how to alleviate poverty in different stages of the life cycle. And the way I like organizing my research is precisely using a life cycle perspective, fertility policies, early education policies, and then employment policies. So let me talk a little bit about what I have studied recently. In one of my papers, I studied China's one-child policy, which is one of the largest policies actually in the history of humanity, in the sense that it restricted the fertility outcomes, or it targeted the fertility outcomes of at least 500,000,000 women. This policy has been studied thoroughly by economists, sociologists, and many others. The objective of that study of mine was to try to figure out how the policy worked at the very granular level and how it restricted the fertility of women across their life cycles. It turns out that while the one-child policy is understood to be a quota system where families are forced to have only one child, the policy is actually much more was actually more complicated than that. Every woman or every single woman in China faced a different policy depending on her demographics and the stage of the life cycle in which she was at each calendar year in which the policy was active. And the way in which the policy was implemented was as a pricing system. So while every woman and her husband were allowed to have one kid, depending on demographics and calendar year, people were allowed to have second and even third children if they paid for permits that had a established price. So part of this project is historical in the sense that I reconstructed what the policy was for a nationally representative set of women and how these prices restricted their fertility across their life cycle. It turns out that the policy has an outcome that already speaks to socioeconomic disadvantage, because while the policy was inelastic and relatively ineffective at lowering fertility, which was one of its main goals, it did restrict fertility in a very specific way, which is that while people did not change the number of boys that they had, they changed their number of girls, and that distorted the child ratio. The child ratio at birth is usually 1.05 girls per one child born, because 1.05 boys per girl born, because boys are a little less resilient in their first 5 years of their life. And the policy distorted this ratio in a way such that there are many more men in China these days than women, and that has a lot of consequences for the way they live their lives and so on, but also for the way in which parents invest in their girls. They prefer to invest in boys rather than girls because boys are seen as more productive, family pride, and so on. So that's just one example of how a very early life policy affects the way in which parents see their children and how much invest in them. So to a degree, part of what that project does is to document that girls are born at a pretty substantial disadvantage in a place like China, where there's a lot of poverty, especially in rural areas. Okay, so I'm interested not only in international policies, I'm interested in domestic policies, in policies that tackle fertility in the United States. And one a lot of my work in the last 5 years has been about early education policies. So while a lot is known about early education, there's actually not a lot of empirical evidence, or there was not a lot of empirical evidence on why spending in early education is effective. There are some studies that predate my work on this with Professor Heckman, but when I came in and started to work with him, there was actually not a study that took a life cycle perspective and analyzed the benefits across different outcomes that people get from being exposed early in life to an early education program. There's a conventional wisdom about it, but not a quantitative analysis that projected the full benefits in outcomes like income, health, education, crime, and so on. So that was my first project with him. We developed a methodology to be able to do those forecasts even when data follow-ups of people who randomly were exposed to early education when they were, let's say, 0 to 5, how they grew up, and data about them were limited. We had data sets in which we would observe people at ages 20, at age 30, at age 40, but we would miss all the in between, and we would miss anything that happened after for them. So using economic models and using econometrics, we formulated methods to forecast the full scope of benefits across the life cycle and until actually forecasted death for the individuals who were given these programs. And we came up with measures of social efficiency that indicate that every dollar spent in early education pays up to $9 of benefit in terms of savings to society due to less crime, a larger tax base due to treated individuals having higher income, better health outcomes, and better education, which in some ways it's a cost to the state that we account for, because education, the K to 12 system it provides free education in general, but that also fosters all sorts of benefits that we document and quantify. Thereafter, I've been also very involved in studying other iconic programs like the Perry Preschool Project, in which we put in some grants long time ago to follow up the subjects of the Perry Preschool Project at age 54, but not only the subjects, but also their children and their siblings who were not directly treated by the program, but could have had benefits by the fact of having either better parents or better siblings. So in that project, we don't have a forecasting issue because we observe individuals annually after these very intensive data collections that we did from ages basically 3 to 54. So we have annual earnings, we have annual indicators of involvement with the criminal justice system, annual education outcomes using administrative data, annual health outcomes using survey data, and so on. And we were able to reinforce the evidence that before was coming from forecast in the study of other programs, and actually find very similar rates of returns, cost-benefit ratios, and so on. But what was newer was that we were able to document intergenerational and intragenerational benefits of these programs. So I'll give you one example. Many people know that the Perry Preschool Project improved the outcomes of those children who were treated by it. Let's say it increased the employment prospects of male participants, the employment rate at age 40 by 25 percentage points. Well, it turns out that the same treatment effects hold for their children who were not treated by the program, and now we observe at an average age of 28, and their siblings who at the time of program implementation were older than them and not treated, and their siblings also have much higher employment rates by around 20 percentage points as well. So in a way, we found that these programs are not child-directed programs, but family policies that reorient the way in which parents invest in their children and reorient the way in which parents interact with them, invest in them, and therefore create an environment for them to succeed. So now let me talk about a couple other projects. One that relates to an international policy that occurred in India, and another domestic policy that I'm actually conducting in South Carolina. So, these two projects had to do with policies that have gained a lot of attention and have the potential to alleviate poverty when properly implemented. One is guaranteed employment and the other is guaranteed income. So let me start with guaranteed employment. In India, in 2005, the constitution was amended to provide each household in rural areas with the right to have 100 days of employment at minimum wage. This was with the objective of ensuring households against shocks that are common in rural areas. For example, you can think about people working in agriculture and the weather not being good for them, and that compromises their harvest. So this program works as an insurance. The interesting part of the program is that it also aimed to help women so that they integrated to the labor force, supposedly. What happened though is that the policy targeted the household and not women specifically. And in India, women work as added or secondary workers, that is, as workers that only help to ensure households when the household earnings are compromised. So what I find in this project is that the policy is actually competing with women as a source of insurance, and once the policy is in place, it decreases their labor force participation. That means that within the household, they're going to bring less money to the table, and what we call in economics their bargaining power, or that directly relates to the share of resources that are spent in them, decreased. So while trying to help women, actually this policy hurt them by competing with them, decreasing their labor force therefore, and decreasing the earnings that they were able to bring to the table. This is a negative finding paper in the sense that the policy is evaluated negatively by me or according to my findings, but it also sheds light on how the policy should be implemented, where instead of targeting the household, the policy should target women. If you want to help women with a policy, you should probably think of targeting women. And in fact, my findings are consistent with a randomized controlled trial that Erica Field and others ran about the same program in India, in one particular state of India, where they changed the status quo of the policy to target women directly, pay them in private accounts for their job, so they broke the competition aspect with the insurance of the households that women usually provide. And they actually find that that change increases the labor force participation of women, and therefore the money they bring to the table and their bargaining power. So while I find that the policy as currently implemented is negative, negative for women, my findings together with this randomized trial find that there's scope for a very similar policy, a slight modification of it, help women increase their bargaining power and increase their attachment to the labor force, which is key to solve poverty of rural women in India. And if you think about it, there are 500,000 women in rural India, so it's a very important problem to solve just because of its magnitude. To finalize, let me talk about something that I'm super excited about. Right now, like I said, I'm a professor in Clemson University, where I am conducting a randomized controlled trial of basic income targeting rural people, mostly women, who live in semi-rural and rural areas that are about 40 minutes away from Clemson University. Guaranteed basic income is a policy that has gained a lot of attention. There's been even presidential candidates who run with the sole purpose of implementing basic income for everyone in the United States, like Andrew Yang. But in this case, we're not thinking about an entire or a representative sample of the United States. We're thinking about poor people because they are the most in need, and we would like to study whether or not this helps them solve a problem that has been discussed in economics and other fields, which is called a poverty trap. An example of a poverty trap is a person could or may have an opportunity to have a job interview, but they can't attend the job interview because it's too expensive for them to get there, right? Like we're talking about rural and semi-rural areas of the deep south where there's no public transit, and transporting yourself from one place to another for a job interview in which you're not sure that you're actually going to get the job, this is a risky investment. So these are the kind of things that guaranteed basic income could be used for. But of course, there's always a question of whether or not providing non-strings attached money to people is going to decrease their labor force. In economics, we would call that, is it subsidizing leisure or non-market activities? So the project is ongoing. We don't have findings yet, but we're super excited to be able to study this policy in an area where there's tremendous need to solve poverty and to try to tackle these kind of poverty traps that I mentioned. And I'll just give a shout out to my collaborators there in South Carolina. Sparrow Financial is a credit union that I work with, and Anderson Interfaith Ministries is a platform where it's a platform serving people with different needs, and they allowed us to come there and interest people in our project, and that's how we ended up randomizing them into either treatment or control. So maybe next time we do this, I can tell you a little more about the findings of that project.